There are lots of ways to make knots. This one being the easiest of them all. It's called the trefoil knot, and it's not as complicated as it looks. It's just a simple overhand knot, and then you connect the two ends together. As you start to think about this, it might occur to you that this is really similar to something that I've done in the past. These can both be considered trefoil knots, but the wooden one is based on a cube, and it's one piece of wood. As I've said, there are lots of ways to make knots, and so far as I understand it, there's no limit to the amount of complexity that we can add to them either. But let's try to keep today's project limited to 2 dimensions, okay? This is sometimes called the endless knot, and I want to make one by using some wooden strips. If you've never thought much about making strips, your gut instinct might tell you, let's just set the fence razor close to the blade and then just cut the stock that way. But there is a better way. These strips are only about 3 millimeters wide, that is about 1/8 of an inch, which isn't very much room between the blade and the fence. And so I've installed a feather board here, attached to a T-slot, and that way I can press my stock right up against the feather board and run it through that way. This way the stock will stay against the fence and the strip will stay in between the feather board and the blade. Just make sure to keep your feather board back behind the blade so that it's not pressing it against the blade after it's already been cut. Now you simply adjust your fence to the feather board, again, for every strip. And of course, a stop block will work just fine instead of a feather board. But these are pretty handy. As the strips are cut, naturally the stock is going to narrow. So eventually the problem becomes that the fence is too close to the blade. There's an easy workaround for this problem. What I'm doing here is using a piece of scrap as kind of a sacrificial board, just to ensure that I don't risk my fence. In this way I can cut the stock entirely down to nothing. There will be only strips and sawdust remaining. As for the very last strip, which is of course optional, cut in a little over halfway, stop the saw, and then flip the piece around. Continue through and turn off the saw as you go, trying to time it so that it just barely makes it through the last little bit of the cut there. At that point, you're within block plane range. Or just hit it with a sander. Next up is the template. We can simplify all the numbers by restricting it to a grid, in which case every square will count as 1 inch, and so it will be 9 inches in each direction. But that makes it too big to fit on a piece of paper, so you'll have to print out 2 of them and then just stick them together somehow. And of course, the printout is in the description. This one-to-one template will make our job a lot easier. And there's lots of miters in this project, but thankfully there's only one angle, 45 degrees. And there's nothing stopping us from cutting more than one of those at a time. But if you use a miter saw to do this, it's preferable to use a backer board and a zero clearance plate. That way you get the nicest cut without splintering anything. Before we do any further cutting, let's first break this apart into simpler parts. The simplest of which being these 8 parts that are all 3 inches long from their longest point to their longest point. But let's think about the tougher parts. And in order to do that, we have to think about chirality. If you spend too much time thinking about the long pieces, you'll note that there are 6 of them total and 2 different types. And that's because there are 3 chiral sets. That is, there's a handedness to it. Left-handed, right-handed. In this case, the part is shaped like a parallelogram. So the way that the carpenter gets around this difference is in the way that he measures, from long point to short point. 8 inches from here to here in this case. And since this is short point, we'd have to add another inch to compensate to get all the way to the long point. Simply put, this part is 8 inches long to short, but it will require a 9-inch piece of stock to compensate for its total length. The trick to using a miter saw is to hold the piece that you're cutting firmly. Even the smallest amount of movement and it can be a catastrophe. Also, cut your pieces a hair long. You can always sand them down later. It's a game of easing up to the goal. The less experience you have with a miter saw, the farther back you should keep your fingers. You can easily use a stick, like a lever, to hold the piece near the blade, rather than using your fingers. Just don't do anything you're not comfortable with. In fact, now that I mention it, this is not the best form that I'm demonstrating here. Ideally, I would have a 45-degree zero clearance fence on the back side of the miter saw on both halves. But given the price of material right now, it just has to wait. This cut right here was a calculated risk. Watch here as the part drops away after it's cut. It has room to move back. And that could have went a lot worse. Ideally, you don't want it to move at all. In order to pull this off, I'll need 6 of these and 8 of these. But these are in bundles of 7. So the plan is to take the extra one here and cut it into one of these. So in theory, I have enough parts to finish this. With a project that has this many miters in it, we want every single one of them to be as close as they can possibly be. So let me say a word on error. So you want to calibrate your miter saw and make sure that you're really cutting 45-degree angles with it. And so you cut a couple pieces of short scrap, fit them together, and it seems nice. Except that when you extend those pieces to long pieces, you also extend the error. And so, as a general rule, you want to fit together long pieces first and then scale down to smaller pieces. When we fit these 2 long pieces together, we can see that it's off of the template just a little bit. And so I want to close up the heel of my cut on the miter saw, which is only a fraction of a degree. Long story short, if I can nail long miters like this, then short ones like these will be a breeze. Remember how the parts were supposed to be a hair long? They're actually supposed to be 2 hairs long for each one of the miters. And now I'm going to cut those hairs off to calibrate this so that it's exactly 45 degrees. And here is how you can cut a teeny tiny part. Note that my cut is only barely proud of the backer board. And also note that I'm only taking a small percentage of a degree off. A block of scrap acts as a fulcrum, and the lever enables you to keep your fingers way out of the blade's way. Press down right here, force is applied there. Connections. As you get better, you'll be able to do 2 or maybe even 3 at a time. But for now, for the sake of the video, let's just do this basic one. Step 1 is to get your connection looking perfect on the template. If you can't do it here, then the finished product isn't going to look good. Next, we connect the 2 together with a piece of masking tape. If you didn't get it perfect, fix it and make it perfect. Flip upside down And do yourself the favor of getting rid of the excess tape. It will get caught on something later, trust me. Face up again to double check and make sure that everything is exactly in line with the template. And if it is, from here on out, we fasten it from the back side. A little bit of wood glue first. And this is just to get a temporary hold. A combination of masking tape and wood glue is more than enough to ensure that nothing moves as we apply the epoxy. What's being used here is just a simple 5-minute set, 2-part epoxy. Get the cheapest stuff you can find. Most of the time when I'm using epoxy, I like to heat it up with a heat gun, and that sort of thins it out by reducing its viscosity. It makes it flow better. It also helps to get air bubbles out. But in this case, I don't want to do that because I want to build the epoxy up so that it has a thickness. You may have had the thought, why does chirality matter at all when I cut a whole bunch of the same part, flip it upside down, and then I have a mirror image anyway? And that would be a fair point to some extent. But not in every case can you use 2 identical parts to make the thing you're making. Chirality matters in this project. This is a rather complicated problem, so let's use some head scratching. We can make it a little bit simpler by breaking it into 2 parts, a green part and a blue part. Then if we look at their relationship, everywhere where one passes over the other, we can help it to sit flatter by removing some of the material. If this is the green part, this intersection here will go over top of blue. And so this needs to have some material removed from underneath. But before I work on that, I want to finish off these last 2 miters by fine-tuning them. With this pair of miters clamped down, this pair can be adjusted to fit. And it becomes pretty clear that if we want these to fit, either we have to add material to the toe or take material away from the heel. Well, since you can't cut on, we'll have to cut off. When you're in the situation, it's best to take a little bit off of each of the parts and not take it all off of one. They'll end up fitting better that way. To get the last 2 miters as close as possible, I did have to take some material out of the blue piece from here and here, and that accounts for 2 of the total 5 places that you'll have to do it on the blue piece. Those places would be here, 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 and here. There are 4 intersections where you'll have to take some material out of the green part, and that would be this intersection, this, and this. I won't pretend as though it wasn't confusing, but here's how I went about it. Note that the blue one goes on top at this intersection. So I marked where the green one goes underneath onto the blue part, and then I take this over to the belt sander where I can carefully scoop out a little of the material from the back side while I pay attention to keeping it centered on these 2 pencil marks. You could skip this process entirely if you just make the parts longer. I'm doing this because I'm being picky, because I want to preserve its grid-like proportions. Can't tell if you can see it, but 5 little coves have been made on the blue part, and now there are 4 to make on the green part. With the blue part clamped on top, now I can just mark the 4 intersections where I'll have to remove some material from the green part. Now that all these notches are done, You might be wondering if what I'm trying to do is even topologically possible. That will depend on how we define possible. Things seem to be going well enough at first until we get to this point. Notice that all of these connections are correct, but this top row of connections is not. So if we could just tease it down just far enough to get this underneath there, but we can't. You can see the length of it just won't allow that to happen. And so if we were to bend it, then we might be able to get it to work. But the problem is, in doing so, there's just too much risk to the wood. Close doesn't count in this game. So unfortunately, we have to try something else. But there's a trick. And before you ask, no, it's not boiling it. Boiling this will make it more flexible, but it also releases the epoxy in all of the connections. I tried. The perfectionist in me does not like to settle on this controlled chaos. However, the utilitarian in me recognizes that we're making an illusion here. Of course, if you're even more of a perfectionist than I, feel free to construct it in 3 parts, and then you won't have any breaks. There's still some detail work remaining, but just for the time being, I have it clamped down just to help it to get used to being where it is. Now we're back to strip making. This time the strips will be much finer, so I'm using a blade that has 40 teeth instead of 24. Also note that this time I'll be using a makeshift riving knife. All this is a wedge that's stuck to the insert plate with a piece of double-sided tape. The wedge runs parallel to the fence and it angles out a little bit so that as the strip passes through, it will be pushed away from the blade. The wood variety I'm using this time is black walnut. And in case you didn't know, not all of black walnut has that rich chocolatey color. That's only the heartwood. That's the desirable stuff. It's lighter on the outside, and you can see the bark here, which is least desirable of all. We'll be using the heartwood so that we get the maximum contrast. It can be a little tricky to sand something that's this thin. It's probably better if you use a scraper. Here I'm using a razor blade, and it works pretty well. I was able to easily get it down to under 1/32 of an inch, which is nice because it cuts easily. However, cutting along the grain is a different story. I suggest that on the back of your rule, on one side you put some electrical tape, and on the other side, fasten a wooden strip with some spray glue. By doing this, the strip that you're trying to cut will slip much less often. This has had plenty of time to become accustomed to where it is. So let's work on these last 2 connections. If you don't mind, let me speak in general for a moment.
It's an often overlooked reality about construction process that small operations lend themselves to a collective strength. Let me explain. Any single part of these connections might not be that strong, but when you put them all together, it makes a strong, unified whole. When you have a larger goal in mind, whenever you make forward progress, even if it's a little forward progress, you're still getting closer to your goal. So even little, seemingly weak connections lend themselves to an overall strength. Even the paint on a wall makes a wall stronger.
The intention here is to be able to hang this on the wall. And by pressing down on these 2 points, we can get it somewhat flat. Some of you already know, I'm very fond of saying that problems that seem overwhelming at first become less overwhelming when you break them down into parts and do those things that you know you can do. So let's start by turning this intersection into a solid connection. We get closer with each step. There are still 8 intersections remaining that are potential connections. Let's try adding a nice drop to each of them right here, and hopefully some will go in between the 2 parts, and then we'll weight it down with a piece of glass, and hopefully it will meet to your satisfaction. Just how close to flat did we get? Well, here's a piece of scrap, and here's a really thin washer. About that close. The hole is just a little bit smaller than the washer. This thing will hang from a screw or a nail in any position around its circle.
As far as displaying this on the wall is concerned, I had a little bit of trouble deciding which way is up. And so I decided not to decide. Instead, I'm trying to be inventive. On its backside, there are still 6 parts that stick out farther than the other places. By making some cork pads, I can make these 6 points of contact the places where it will press against the wall, and the screw will hold it tight against the wall.
Now we should be able to use the springiness to our advantage. Once the screw is adjusted correctly, it snaps into place and holds nice and tightly, no matter how you rotate it. And it's not easy to pull it off.
Now it's also magnetic, which is another feature I plan on taking advantage of. A project like this might not be as involved or as tedious as it may look, and so I encourage you to give it a try if you can. In either case, I hope you found some value in this, and now it's on to the next project. I have other knots to untie, because it never ends, right? I think that was kind of the point here. See ya.